The Montecito air that morning was unusually dense, almost oppressive, as though the very clouds above had been summoned down into the turmoil brewing inside the vast mansion. The silence of the estate, normally tranquil and serene, was torn apart in an instant when Prince Harry's voice rang out, slicing through the stillness like a sharpened blade. "You thief, get out right now." The words echoed against the walls, startling in their raw intensity. This was not the kind of eruption anyone would have anticipated, from a prince known for his composure, for his controlled demeanour, for his almost royal restraint. Yet there it was unpolished, furious, unrestrained. That single outburst was more than a mere accusation. It carried the weight of years upon years of quiet tension, murmured suspicions, whispered secrets, and deeply buried pain. But what exactly had driven Harry, a man carrying the burden of so many legacies and emotions, to reach such a breaking point? And why at this moment, in the seemingly calm yet heavy atmosphere of Montecito? Before we move further into this extraordinary account, please remember to press the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. You might believe you already know Meghan Markle, the woman who captured not only the heart of a prince, but also the fascination of the world. To millions, she is the smiling figure on red carpets, the eloquent speaker in carefully arranged interviews, the graceful presence across meticulously managed social media. Yet behind those public appearances there has always existed another dimension, one that is far more private, complicated, and often cloaked in controversy. On that unforgettable day in Montecito, according to several sources and witnesses, that private and more hidden side clashed violently with one of the most sacred treasures. Harry possesses the memory and the heirlooms of his beloved mother, Princess Diana. The jewel at the centre of the storm, quite literally, was not an ordinary ornament. These were no simple accessories. They were pieces from Diana's most intimate and personal collection jewels she had worn before the eyes of the entire world. Items saturated with history, memory, and emotion. To outsiders, the situation may have sounded trivial, a superficial quarrel about material objects. But to Harry, these jewels were far more than precious stones or glittering metals. They were extensions of his mother's spirit, symbols of a life stolen too soon, embodiments of loyalty, of trust, of family legacy. When whispers began to surface, first quietly, then growing louder, suggesting that someone close to him might have taken more than devotion, more than love, those murmurs struck like thunder. They sent tremors not only through his household, but across the very narrative of the royal family itself. So, what exactly unfolded that morning? How did a serene coastal dawn transform into a confrontation that no one could have foreseen? And perhaps most pressing of all, why does it matter with such gravity not only to Harry and Meghan, but to the millions of people who have followed their journey with fascination, with sympathy, and at times with unrelenting scepticism? To understand, we must trace the story back far before that single morning, unravelling the delicate strands of trust, secrecy, and expectation that had been tightly woven across the years of their relationship. Meghan had always been a figure subject to piercing scrutiny, adored by some, criticised bitterly by others. She walked through the world with ambition, poise, and a carefully designed image. Yet, according to those closest to the couple, within that carefully crafted exterior existed layers of complexity few were ever allowed to glimpse. Admirers described her as magnetic, charismatic, and fiercely independent. Detractors painted her as calculating, manipulative, and secretive. Whichever side one might take, one truth remains undeniable: the meeting of Meghan's past, Harry's unwavering loyalty to the memory of his mother, and the priceless legacy of Diana's jewels created a volatile pressure chamber of emotion, destined sooner or later to erupt. Picture for a moment the setting in Montecito. The mansion's sweeping architecture, framed by its meticulously tended gardens and the calm backdrop of the Pacific Ocean, projected an image of perfection. To any casual onlooker, it seemed paradise itself, the very dream home that celebrities and royals alike often seek to shield themselves from the relentless gaze of the public. Yet, inside those walls, the air was heavy, the tension alive, almost physical. Harry, ordinarily so composed, moved restlessly with a kind of energy that seemed impossible to restrain. Meghan, by most accounts, wore a mask of calm, yet her hands trembling ever so slightly betrayed a current of unease she could not conceal. Words were exchanged, sharp and deliberate, carrying the weight of years of unspoken grievances. Then came the cry, "You thief, get out right now." It was more than an accusation of theft. It was an eruption of emotion, laying bare hidden wounds, betrayals long buried, and fears too powerful to contain. For Harry, this was never only about jewels. It was about memory, about respect, about the preservation of a legacy. For Meghan, the accusation struck at the very foundation of her identity, both the public persona she had built with such precision and the private self she kept guarded from the world. That morning in Montecito was a moment when both masks fell away. To grasp the true weight of it all, we must step back further still, peeling away the layers of family expectations, inherited burdens, and personal ambition that set the stage for the explosion that followed. Harry had grown up beneath the unrelenting shadow of intense public scrutiny, constantly aware of the legacy of his mother, whose extraordinary life and tragic death had come to symbolise both the soaring triumphs and the bitter failures of in the royal family. For him, Diana's jewels were not mere adornments of beauty or status. They were sacred relics, reminders of a life that had shaped him profoundly, a tangible bond to the mother he had lost far too early. Each piece represented more than brilliance or wealth. They were emblems of trust, vessels of memory, and the ultimate test of whether those closest to him could be entrusted with the past, with Diana's spirit, and with the preservation of her legacy. Meghan's entry into this world was anything but simple. She was a Hollywood actress, stepping into centuries-old traditions, rigid customs, and weighty expectations that had defined royalty for generations. She bore the dual and heavy burden of being an outsider, while simultaneously becoming an object of fascination across the globe. From her early days in Los Angeles to her transformation on the world's royal stage, every action, every word, and every choice was dissected, analysed, and magnified beyond recognition. Yet Montecito was different. It represented a more private form of scrutiny. Scrutiny not from cameras or tabloids, but from the man she had married, from the family whose legacy she had become woven into, and from the silent, unspoken code of honour and trust that governed the treasures now placed within her reach. And still, the drama of that fateful morning cannot be untangled from the raw human emotions beneath it. Anger, fear, betrayal, grief, all collided in a moment so charged, so electric, it carried the weight of a scene from a powerful film. Witnesses described Harry's eyes as wide, unflinching, burning with fury, while his voice thundered through the cavernous halls. Meghan's expression, caught between defiance and apprehension, betrayed the realization that what had been simmering silently for so long had finally erupted into the open. Even the jewels themselves, though silent and lifeless in form, became central characters in the story, embodying more than material wealth. They were anchors of memory, silent symbols of trust, and the undeniable catalyst for a confrontation that shook the very foundation of their union. Here lies the dilemma. No matter how much the public speculates, the complete truth remains just beyond reach, tantalizingly obscured. Rumours, multiplied accounts from insiders, trickled out snippets of private conversations leaked into the public sphere. Yet the full picture has never been revealed, and this only deepens the intrigue. Why would someone so intent on carefully shaping her image, so intensely aware of perception, find herself enmeshed in a scandal of this magnitude? And why would Harry, so often praised for his measured control, reach a breaking point where he lost his composure in the sanctuary of his own home? To the casual audience, it may resemble the script of a dramatic movie, but it was real, painfully, undeniably real. This was no fabricated scandal. It was the collision of immense wealth, fragile trust, towering legacy, and human emotion, all unfolding within a grand estate overlooking the vast Pacific Ocean. It was a story of what people are capable of when the stakes soar, when emotions boil, and when the past refuses to remain silent. It was a moment when one man's fury collided with one woman's secrets, leaving scars that would alter them forever. So what did truly occur within the walls of the Montecito mansion? How could a confrontation that began with words escalate into something that sent ripples through royal circles, into the echo chambers of the media, and into the collective consciousness of the public? And most haunting of all, what exactly was taken? What was lost? And what does it mean for Diana's legacy, for Harry as her son, and for Meghan as his wife? This tale cannot be reduced to a simple scandal. It is a study of trust, fractured, of betrayal endured, and of the crushing pressures that arise when history, legacy, and ambition converge in ways impossible to contain. Over the course of this story, we will peel back every layer of this confrontation, from the smallest details of that morning to the sweeping historical meaning of the treasures at its centre. From the testimony of those inside to the implications for the royal family itself. You will hear revelations that shock, discoveries that stun, and questions that perhaps will never be fully answered. But one thing is certain: what came next would alter everything, and not a single person saw it coming. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the very air tighten, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath? That is precisely the atmosphere that cloaked the Montecito mansion that morning. To the eye of a casual visitor, it was flawless sunlight danced on the rolling Pacific, immaculate gardens stretched endlessly, and walls were adorned with art and heirlooms. But inside, the tension was palpable, thick, nearly physical. Harry's fury had not erupted suddenly. It had been smouldering building for weeks, for months, perhaps even years, until at last it had reached the point of no return. Picture Harry, ordinarily so controlled, pacing across polished marble floors, his hands locked tightly behind his back, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting with a volatile mixture of hurt, suspicion, and disbelief. Each echoing step through the halls was like the beat of a drum announcing the gathering storm. Meghan, by contrast, sat, or more accurately struggled to remain seated, graceful in posture, but unable to conceal the tremor in her hands. Her eyes flickered toward Harry again and again, searching desperately for the smallest clue, a sign, any hint of what had propelled this volcanic eruption, yet his expression remained unreadable. That unreadability itself only deepened the suspense, heightening the drama, a silent battle of power and vulnerability playing out before invisible witnesses. So, what invisible fissure had finally given way? What fault line had cracked so suddenly, causing a private confrontation that would eventually fuel headlines long before its full story was known? As insiders later revealed, the truth was not simply about possessions, nor solely about jewels, nor even about a single misunderstanding. At its very core, it was about trust, or more precisely, the devastating fracture of trust. Every word Harry shouted was weighted with the agony of betrayal left unspoken. Every pause, every glare, every hesitant step Meghan took was met with suspicion. Even the mansion itself, majestic as it was, seemed to bear witness in silence. The marble floors mirrored the tension in their sheen. The towering walls absorbed his booming voice and hurled it back in waves. "You thief, get out right now." The cry did not merely reverberate through the room. It seemed suspended in the very air, refusing to fade, pressing down on everyone within earshot. And then there were the jewels, the invisible presence of Diana's collection, stored carefully but within reach in a secure part of the mansion. They made the accusations heavier, sharper, impossible to ignore. Each gem was a story, a memory, a fragment of the mother Harry adored and lost. He had vowed to guard them, to honour them, to keep them safe. To him, they were not luxury, they were legacy. And Meghan? What thoughts coursed through her in that moment? Was she stunned into silence, defensive and ready to push back? Or had she been bracing herself for this inevitable clash all along? According to those who claim to know, it was a mixture of all three. Some observers described her calm exterior as almost theatrical, a mask of serenity hiding a storm brewing inside. Others suggested she had long anticipated this confrontation, but never imagined the sheer ferocity of Harry's eruption. Whispers even circulated that small gestures, comments, or subtle actions in the days just before that morning had stoked the fire of suspicion, feeding tension until the final spark ignited an implosion no one could stop. What makes this confrontation so compelling, so unforgettable, is the way an ordinary domestic setting, though extraordinary in its scale, wealth and fame, was transformed into a battlefield. The rooms, the elegant furniture, the rays of sunlight streaming through expansive windows, all of these silent witnesses became unwilling participants in a storm of memory, grief, suspicion and rage. And then just when it seemed the mounting tension could be measured in steps, in breaths, in mere seconds, a single act tipped everything further. An object was shifted. A drawer creaked open. A glance lingered a moment too long. In that instant, the fragile balance shattered. The accusation of theft was no longer an intangible suspicion whispered in the dark. In Harry's mind, it had solidified into a reality undeniable, tangible, almost impossible to refute. Yet the conflict was never only about physical possessions. Every jewel, every delicate trinket, each piece of Diana's treasured legacy carried layers of stories, history, and meaning. Harry's eruption was as much about defending that history as it was about confronting what he believed to be betrayal. Every word that escaped his lips, every step that pounded across polished marble floors, every pause of silence was saturated with emotion, grief for the mother he had lost. Frustration at the relentless media spectacle that circled them, fear that integrity itself was slipping away, and raw anger towards someone he had trusted above all else. The mansion, once his refuge, now became a crucible. Its very hallways echoed unspoken questions. How far had Meghan gone? What truths were being hidden? Could there be secrets poised to upend everything he thought he knew about his wife, his family, and his mother's legacy? Those questions hung in the air, like smoke, invisible, yet suffocating. According to accounts, discreet security cameras never meant for public eyes captured fleeting glimpses of the standoff, Harry fists clenched, storming into the room. Meghan seated back straight, fighting to maintain her composure. The jewels themselves were never touched, at least not physically, but their presence, heavy with symbolism, fueled the emotional blaze. Insiders later described it as a psychological chess match where every shift of posture, every flicker of the eyes, every word uttered carried layers of possible meaning. Who held the upper hand? Was it truly about control, or was it fear? Wearing the mask of authority. What made this scene even more haunting was the gulf between appearance and reality. To the outside world, Montecito radiated peace. On social media, the mansion appeared like a haven of luxury, of serenity, of perfection. But behind those grand walls, turmoil raged. Harry's fury, Meghan's restrained unease, and the silent, unyielding weight of history collided in a way that would shape not only their marriage, but also the story told about Diana's enduring legacy. Some witnesses later suggested that this confrontation was not born in a single morning. It had been growing quietly for years, brick upon brick, the result of countless small miscommunications, perceived slights, and unresolved grievances. Every disagreement, every attempt at reconciliation had added to a reservoir of tension that eventually burst. Still, the haunting question lingers. Was this truly the first time Harry had accused Meghan of crossing a line, or had there been smaller clashes, each one simmering, stacking, and finally culminating in this eruption? It is nearly impossible to separate the human emotion from the symbols at its centre. For the jewels, though, never stolen in the literal sense, at least not according to what has been reported, were never just gems. They were trust. They were legacy. They were a connection to the woman Harry loved more than anyone else. To accuse another of violating that trust was not a simple accusation. It was a blow aimed directly at memory honour and the most intimate parts of the heart. In that sense, Harry's anguished cry was not only rage, it was grief, it was fear, and it was desperation, all bound together. As the intensity climbed higher, Meghan's own reactions became a story of their own. Some insiders noted a flicker of steel in her eyes, a tiny spark of defiance, a shift in her posture that seemed to signal she was readying herself for whatever storm was about to break. Others, however, described vulnerability, small hints of remorse or perhaps fear at the tidal wave of public scrutiny that would inevitably follow. The complexity of her expression made the entire scene nearly unbearable to imagine. Every heartbeat in that room seemed to carry centuries of expectation, of legacy, of scrutiny pressing down her shoulders. And then the moment came, the pivotal shift, described by insiders as both shocking and surreal. A single word uttered, a simple gesture, a movement made. Reports diverged. Some insisted Meghan moved toward a display case, while others claimed she spoke a remark that deliberate or not poured oil on the fire of Harry's emotions. Whatever the truth, that was the spark that transformed the mansion into a furnace of history and meaning. The estate, once a backdrop for wealth and tranquility, became an arena of human conflict, where the highest stakes imaginable were being fought for trust, memory, and legacy. Yet for all its intensity, this confrontation was not an ending. It was only the beginning. The storm that broke in Montecito that morning would ripple outward, twisting through media narratives, whispered insider accounts, and the evolving perceptions of Harry and Meghan in the eyes of the world. And as you, the audience, absorb these details, ask yourself if one of the most private, secure places on earth can unravel into such explosive drama. What does that reveal about the unbearable pressures of fame, of legacy, and of trust itself? Because what followed would alter everything, and no one, not even those within those walls, saw it coming. Have you ever wondered what truly shapes a person before the spotlight burns down upon them? Before the crushing weight of fame, expectation, and history bears down Meghan Markle's past, is just such a labyrinth woven from ambition, talent, resilience, and secrets. Some of these secrets are well known. Others remain hidden from view. And to truly understand the firestorm in Montecito, one must retrace the path of who Meghan was, long before royal cameras shadowed her every move, before newspapers branded her the Duchess of Controversy, and before the whispers of theft and betrayal swelled into thunder. Meghan's childhood in Los Angeles was a blend of privilege and fragility, a life caught between moments of comfort and episodes of instability. She navigated complicated family dynamics with step-siblings and parents whose lives diverged in ways that left her to find her own balance, her own resilience, in a world that seemed always to demand she prove herself. From her earliest years, She learned to observe carefully, to measure the room, to understand motives, to anticipate reactions before they were spoken. She studied the subtleties many others might overlook, the immense power of appearances, the currency of charm, and the remarkable influence of a word placed at just the right time. Her career in Hollywood appeared almost inevitable. Small acting jobs led to larger ones. Commercials turned into television roles, and eventually she stepped into the part that made her recognisable around the world in the series Suits. But beneath the surface of glitz and red carpets, those closest to her would later reveal there was far more at work. Meghan was not only an actress, she was a strategist. She understood timing, she mastered influence, and she cultivated her public image with precision. Relationships were not merely social, they were steps toward purpose. Alliances were chosen, maintained, or let go with care. Many mistook this as natural charm, but in truth, it was the result of deliberate, honed calculation. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew where she was headed and how she would get there, even if the rest of the world could not see it. And yet, Hollywood was never simply a platform for fame and glamour. It was a crucible, a relentless proving ground where ambition collided with competition, and secrecy became currency. Contracts, endless auditions, relentless media scrutiny, and the delicate dance of public perception create an environment where trust was fragile and often fleeting, and alliances were as temporary as they were transactional. In that world, Meghan absorbed lessons she would carry into every sphere of her life thereafter, from the dazzling stages of Hollywood to the centuries-old halls of royal palaces, and eventually to the private chambers of the Montecito mansion. She learned to read perception as if it were a language, to recognise its stakes, and to wield influence in ways that could be both subtle and powerful, and at times dangerously easy to misconstrue. But her story was not defined only by strategy or calculation. Beneath the polished exterior, there existed layers of vulnerability and personal struggle that shaped her character in ways the public rarely glimpsed. Sources close to her have suggested that Meghan endured long periods of isolation, relentless criticism, and the suffocating pressure to adapt constantly to shifting expectations. She had to reconcile her own ambition with societal norms, her identity with public projection, and the growing demands of a career that would one day thrust her onto a global stage. Those experiences forged resilience, but they also etched into her patterns of discretion, habits of secrecy, and a need for careful navigation traits that would later be recast under the unforgiving eye of royal scrutiny as controversial and divisive. When Meghan met Harry, she did not step into a simple love story. She entered an entirely different world, one governed by centuries of tradition, ritual, and unyielding expectation. The royal family, with its weight of history and its constant public gaze, was a stage that made Hollywood look like a rehearsal. And though Meghan's skills in perception, negotiation, and public presence were finely tuned, there were challenges no amount of acting or media training could prepare her for. The legacy of Diana, the constant pull of public expectation, the symbolic codes of royal conduct, all combined to create pressures unlike anything she had faced before. The jewels in Harry's possession, Diana's most cherished relics, were not simply adornments. They were sacred symbols of trust and emotional inheritance. Meghan's proximity to them, whether innocent or misunderstood, would one day become the centre of Montecito's most infamous confrontation. Consider for a moment the paradox of Meghan's life. In Hollywood, she had mastered visibility, she could command a scene, a screen, or an audience with poise and confidence. Yet, within the world of royalty, she was learning to exist within invisibility, navigating silent codes of approval and disapproval from a family whose acceptance was never assured. On camera, she could deliver a line flawlessly, but in the palace, every glance, every gesture, every word carried layers of meaning she could not always predict. Her instincts, honed under the spotlight, sometimes clashed with the understated, symbolic, and often unspoken rules of royal life. That tension, compounded by her personal ambition and independent personality, created a fragile equilibrium, one that could easily tip when emotions burned too hot. Insiders whisper of yet another dimension to Meghan's past: the influence of a complex network of friends, mentors, and professional advisors who shaped her decisions in subtle but significant ways. Hollywood connections, seasoned media consultants, and trusted confidants offered guidance, but their influence also introduced complications. Allegiances shifted, advice conflicted, and Meghan found herself navigating not only the expectations of her husband and his storied family, but also the echoes of her own past alliances. According to several accounts, the infamous Montecito clash was fueled in part by this collision of personal, professional, and familial history's forces that converged in ways no one fully understood until it was too late. And yet, Meghan's story cannot be reduced to ambition or manipulation alone. There were moments of disarming charm, genuine empathy, and unmistakable vulnerability that made her captivating not only to Harry, but to the public at large. She had mastered the art of narrative, of crafting stories that resonated deeply and emotionally. But this gift, so effective in public, became a double-edged sword in private. In the heated intimacy of Montecito, where Harry's emotions were unfiltered and raw, the very skills that had once elevated Meghan could suddenly appear manipulative, even threatening. A gesture meant to soothe could be misread. A carefully chosen word could be taken as strategic deception. The line between intent and perception blurred dangerously, creating fertile ground for misunderstanding, frustration, and eventual explosion. What makes this chapter particularly dramatic is the clash between Meghan's carefully constructed public image and the private reality Harry confronted that day. To outsiders, accusations about jewels or whispers of theft might seem simplistic matters of black and white, but reality is always far messier. These conflicts were entangled with layers of history, psychology, and deep human emotion. Meghan's past, her upbringing, her career, her unyielding ambition, was inseparable from the way she handled conflict, confrontation, and accusation. From a distance, judgment comes easily. Up close, the Montecito scene was the collision of complex histories, layered personalities and stakes, so immense that few outside their world could ever hope to grasp their weight. And then comes the most enduring question. How much of Meghan's past coloured Harry's perception that morning? Was he reacting solely to the events unfolding before him? Or was every movement and every word filtered through the lens of her, in history through stories he had heard, and through the weight of his own fears? The truth likely lies in a painful blend of both. Human emotion never exists in isolation. Memory, expectation, and experience intertwine with perception, creating interpretations that can escalate even the smallest of sparks into roaring flames. In this case, Meghan's Hollywood background, her cultivated instincts, and her polished persona were woven into a broader narrative that amplified Harry's suspicion, frustration, and finally, his rage. And then the question of intent lingers, haunting every retelling. Did Meghan act with malice, or was she simply navigating a world she interpreted differently than Harry's perspective is everything here? Supporters argue her actions were consistent with a life of calculated adaptation, shaped by careful thinking and survival in competitive arenas. Critics counter that those same qualities, her secrecy, her precision, her strategy, nurtured mistrust and even manipulation, making her appear guilty of betrayals she may never have intended. In Montecito, there was no judge, no impartial arbiter, only two people bound by history, burdened by expectation, colliding with explosive force. What makes this chapter of Meghan's journey so essential is not whether she was right or wrong, but how it frames everything that followed. Understanding her past is not about absolution or condemnation, it is about context. Every glance exchanged, every sharp word, every accusation in Montecito was informed by decades of preparation, adaptation, and survival. And when those elements collided with Harry's raw devotion to his mother and the near sacred symbolism of her jewels, the outcome was inevitable. It was a confrontation that not only seized public attention, but reshaped it, dominating speculation and forever altering the way both Meghan and Harry would be perceived on the global stage. So, what unfolded next? How did a woman, moulded by ambition, sharpened by talent, and driven by strategic thinking, react when confronted with accusations that struck at the very heart of Harry's most sacred legacies? And how did this charge, in a moment, illuminate not only the fragile dynamics between two people, but also the crushing weight of fame, family, and public expectation in ways few could ever have predicted? What took place inside the walls of Montecito was far more than a quarrel between husband and wife. It was a collision of histories, a clash of buried emotions, and the eruption of secrets that carried consequences far beyond the mansion itself. And just when it seemed the threads of Meghan's past had been traced, a revelation surfaced, one that overturned the narrative, entirely linking old Hollywood ties with Diana's treasured legacy and complicating everything we thought we understood. When you hear the name Princess Diana, what rises first in your mind? Compassion and kindness, or perhaps the shadow of tragedy? Or is it the image of the crown jewels glittering beneath royal lights, shimmering symbols of both power and heritage? For Prince Harry, his mother's legacy was never an abstraction. It was visceral, alive. It lived in cherished memories, in faded photographs, in stories told and retold, and, most poignantly, in the collection of jewels that embodied not only his mother's life, but also the very essence of the family she once represented. These pieces were never simply ornaments. They were vessels of memory, tangible reminders of trust, of love, of responsibility. And in Montecito, they became the emotional fulcrum, the silent, immovable actors in a confrontation few could have imagined. To grasp why Harry's reaction toward Meghan that morning was so fierce, one must first understand the immense weight of Diana's legacy. Diana was not just a princess. She was an icon, a global figure whose life embodied both extraordinary devotion and profound vulnerability. She lived in the unending tension between public expectation and private pain, a balance that Harry inherited in both subtle and unmistakable ways. Each jewel Diana wore told a story. The iconic engagement ring, the striking sapphire necklace, the delicate diamond bracelets. Every piece symbolised a promise, a memory, a moment in time, cut tragically short. For Harry, preserving these treasures was almost a sacred duty. They served as a tangible tether to the mother he had lost far too young a way of keeping her presence alive in a world eager to reduce her to myth or scandal. And yet, jewels, much like memory itself, are open to interpretation. To the world they shine as symbols of glamour, luxury, and aspiration. To family, they carry a different weight, sacred, emblematic, nearly alive in their emotional resonance. When Meghan entered Harry's life, she came face to face with this legacy not only in metaphor, but in the most physical and immediate sense. The act of standing near, of holding, or even brushing against these deeply significant objects had the power to magnify tension, to invite misunderstanding, and in some cases, to ignite suspicion. According to insiders, that is precisely what unfolded. Take, for example, Diana's engagement ring, a jewel that has become emblematic not just of royal romance, but also of Harry's devotion both to his mother's memory and to his chosen love. That sapphire ring is far more than a dazzling gem. It is continuity protection, inheritance made tangible. When Harry offered it to Meghan, he did so with the hope that she would carry not just its beauty, but also its meaning, its story, and the emotional weight it bore. To him, it was a living link between past and present, between his grief and his hope. But as the confrontation in Montecito escalated, even that ring, once a symbol of devotion and continuity, became a focal point of tension, an object now burdened with accusation, suspicion, and fear. It is essential to understand the complexity of this dynamic. Diana's life and possessions carried multiple layers of meaning, and each layer could be interpreted in vastly different ways depending on who was looking. To the public, these jewels sparkled as tokens of wealth and inheritance. To Harry, they were infused with reverence, grief, and responsibility. His cry, "You thief, get out right now," was not merely an accusation about physical objects. It was an anguished reaction to what he perceived as a violation of trust, an emotional trespass, and an existential threat to a legacy that was sacred beyond words. Each syllable he spoke was heavy with history, grief, and the silent rules of respect that had long governed his relationship with his mother's memory. Diana's legacy, however, was never just about glittering objects. It was about values, lessons, and unspoken truths. She taught her sons empathy, compassion, resilience lessons, often overlooked by the public, but deeply internalized by Harry. Those values became the compass he carried into adulthood, into his marriage, and into the private realm where legacy, memory, and human conflict intersected. The jewels, the mansion, the gaze of the world, they were secondary to this deeper inheritance. And when he perceived even the faintest threat to it, his reaction was immediate, raw, and unrestrained. Complicating all of this was the ceaseless collision between public and private perception. Diana's life had been dissected endlessly, her every gesture and accessory analysed, mythologized, and debated. For Harry, these jewels were not museum pieces. They were living remnants of a mother whose life had been misinterpreted and politicised at every turn. Meghan, by joining his life, inevitably stepped into that same narrative. A narrative laden with centuries of expectation, obsession, and reverence. Even the smallest movement, the slightest glance could take on exaggerated, disproportionate significance in such a context. Imagine for a moment the symbolism of a single sapphire earring. To Harry, it was his mother, a fragment of her lingering presence. To outsiders, it was nothing more than a sparkling accessory. To Meghan, it may have represented style, fashion, or even opportunity. These competing perceptions created a silent but crushing weight, an invisible pressure that no etiquette guide, no media training, no heartfelt conversation could fully prepare her to face. And in Montecito, that pressure swelled until it reached its breaking point. But Diana's legacy was never confined to objects. Her impact ran deeper, shaping the royal family, shaping Harry's very sense of identity, and shaping the way the world came to view monarchy itself. She embodied a paradox strength, bound to vulnerability, openness wrapped around caution, love tethered to constant vigilance. Harry inherited this paradox, and his protective instincts over her legacy were amplified by it, fueled by grief and the unending burden of public eyes. The confrontation with Meghan was therefore not just a quarrel within a marriage. It was the eruption of decades of emotional inheritance, cultural expectation, and personal devotion colliding all at once within the walls of that mansion in Montecito. And yet, the entire situation was wrapped in contradictions too complex to ignore. According to several accounts, Meghan had often spoken with genuine admiration for Diana, acknowledging both the sacrifices and the unbearable pressures that came with royal life. She reportedly expressed understanding of the jewels' emotional significance, even reverence for what they symbolised. And yet, in Harry's mind, perception diverged sharply from intention. Human emotion rarely exists in isolation. It is filtered through history, memory, and context. In such high-stakes moments, even the most innocent gesture can be interpreted as threatening when the emotional backdrop is as heavy as Harry's inheritance of grief, legacy, and duty. What makes this confrontation even more compelling is the uneasy interplay between secrecy and revelation. Diana's legacy, by its very nature, was always deeply private, even when performed before the unblinking gaze of the world. Her greatest lessons were not taught in speeches or ceremonies, but in whispers, in fleeting gestures, in the quiet spaces where cameras were absent. Harry's instinct to protect his mother's memory was therefore not only about guarding jewels, it was about preserving the integrity of those private truths, the silent bonds that existed between mother and son. Any breach of trust, whether real or merely perceived, struck directly at the heart of that sacred duty. As the Montecito confrontation unfolded, Diana's legacy seemed to permeate every detail. The mansion itself, the glitter of sunlight bouncing off the Pacific, the weight of the heirlooms, they all became charged with layered meaning. Every look exchanged between Harry and Meghan carried with it echoes of history, of expectation, of silent burdens inherited. Every step, every word, every breath in that room was amplified by memory and by the symbolic gravity of what was at stake. And this is why that morning's drama extends far beyond a single argument. It was not only about jewels. It was about the collision of memory inheritance and raw human emotion in its most combustible form. But here lies the twist that heightens the tension further. The jewels themselves may never have been mishandled at all. Insiders whisper that the theft Harry shouted about might have been more symbolic than literal, a cry born out of perceived betrayal, secrecy, or clashing values rather than an actual physical act of taking. Yet in moments of heightened emotion, perception hardens into reality. The screaming, the pacing, the unyielding tension, those were real, regardless of whether a single gem had been touched. Montecito itself became an intersection where past and present collided, where love and suspicion clashed, where legacy acted as both blessing and burden. For Harry, safeguarding Diana's memory was non-negotiable. For Meghan, navigating that same terrain required not only tact, but also empathy, insight, and precision. And on that morning, those requirements fell into collision, leaving scars that would forever shape how their relationship and their place in history would be perceived. And just when it seemed the crushing weight of legacy had reached its breaking point, another revelation surfaced, one that linked Hollywood ties, royal expectations, and closely guarded private secrets in a way no one could have foreseen, setting the stage for a drama so explosive it would dominate global headlines. Now consider this: what if? What truly transpired in Montecito was not first captured by tabloids or by the intrusive lenses of paparazzi, but by the silent, unblinking eyes of hidden cameras and the memories of those present. The story of Harry and Meghan's confrontation is not mere rumour. It has been pieced together from eyewitness accounts, leaked fragments of testimony, and discreet observations within the mansion. And what emerges is not only shocking, but deeply painfully human. Step for a moment into the grand halls of Montecito. Floors polished like mirrors reflected every tense movement. The walls lined with art and heirlooms seemed to bear witness to private dramas they were never meant to reveal. Security cameras, positioned discreetly for protection rather than spectacle, became unexpected witnesses to an emotional storm. According to household insiders, those cameras captured more than footsteps and gestures. They recorded the language of bodies, the clenched fists, the quickened breaths, the unspoken tension that no words could adequately convey. Witnesses describe Harry pacing the length of the polished floor, His hands balled tight, his jaw locked, his eyes aflame with the sharp mixture of grief and anger. Meghan, seated across from him, held a calm exterior that to those who looked closer betrayed flickers of unease, her fingers trembling slightly, her gaze darting in measured intervals. The silence was punctuated only by Harry's footsteps, by sharp exhales, by moments so taut they seemed cinematic. Except this was no performance. It was painfully, undeniably real. What strikes most from these accounts is the layering of emotion. Harry's scream, "You thief, get out right now," was not only an accusation of wrongdoing, it was grief for his mother, frustration at years of relentless pressure, fear of betrayal, and the desperate need to defend what was sacred to him. Every word carried years of unprocessed pain sharpened into the rawness of that moment. Meghan's response, in contrast, was measured restraint. Some witnesses recall her leaning back, drawing a deliberate breath, and answering with carefully chosen words. Others insist there were stretches of silence, her gaze flicking toward the jewels that had become both symbols and weapons in their struggle. Adding to the intensity were those behind the scenes, the security staff, the aides, the quiet household figures who glimpsed fragments of the storm. One staffer reportedly described Meghan reaching for an object only to freeze halfway, a hesitation Harry read as confirmation of his darkest fears. Another remembered the air itself vibrating with tension, every gesture magnified, every glance transformed into accusation. Even the architecture, the soaring ceilings, the reflective marble, the windows spilling sunlight across the room seemed to amplify the confrontation, making every emotion feel louder, sharper, inescapable. Yet no two accounts align perfectly. Some sources maintain Meghan's intent was never malicious, that she had acted with controlled restraint, attempting to calm a storm that had been gathering for months. Others contend that subtle manipulations deliberate or not only deepened Harry's suspicions. These contradictions are vital to understanding Montecito. Human conflict, especially under immense pressure, is never straightforward. Perception blurs with intent, hesitation becomes evidence, and silence itself can feel like betrayal. In that crucible, the line between truth and interpretation dissolved, leaving behind a moment destined to echo for years. And then there is the role of timing, a detail that makes the Montecito confrontation even more layered and compelling. Witnesses stressed that what erupted that morning was not a single flash of anger, but the culmination of smaller incidents strung together like sparks feeding into a fire. A disagreement earlier in the day, combined with the weight of long-standing anxieties and unresolved arguments, created the perfect storm. By the time Harry finally reached his breaking point, it was not only about the present. It was about the entire accumulation of past frustrations, miscommunications, and his deepest fears about protecting Diana's legacy. What gives this chapter its haunting complexity are the hidden nuances preserved in off-the-record footage. According to insiders, the cameras captured not only the obvious confrontation, but fleeting moments of raw humanity. At times, Harry's voice, though sharp and commanding, softened, unexpectedly, betraying the grief and vulnerability buried beneath his anger. Meghan, though poised, revealed subtle flickers of defensiveness and confusion, even hurt. These micro-expressions, imperceptible to most transformed what appeared on the surface to be a straightforward accusation into a deeply layered emotional reckoning. And then came the pivotal moment. Witnesses identify as the turning point, a movement, a glance, a phrase. Accounts differ, but whatever it was, it triggered the peak of Harry's fury. Some claim Meghan reached toward a small jewellery case, an action innocuous in any other context, but interpreted by Harry as confirmation of his deepest fears. Others insist the crescendo came when Harry sensed, rightly or wrongly, that the symbols of his mother's legacy were being treated with too little reverence. Whatever the exact trigger, it marked the moment when private frustration hardened into something unforgettable. an eruption that turned the walls of the mansion into the unwilling stage of a family tragedy. Testimonies from those physically present only deepened the intrigue. One aide recalled Harry's voice as both fractured and commanding a strange mix of paternal authority, grief, and desperation. Another described Meghan's composure as so controlled it seemed almost rehearsed her careful tone, suggesting strategy even under fire. These contradictions make the truth elusive. Was Harry spiralling into overreaction, blinded by grief and suspicion, or was Meghan's calm and its precision a form of defence that only intensified his distrust? In moments like these, intent often matters less than perception, and perception was precisely what tore the scene apart. Even the jewels themselves became silent actors in the unfolding drama. Their placement on a table, their visibility in a display case, their storied history all seemed to breathe life into the confrontation. As one insider poignantly remarked, those jewels weren't objects, they were Diana. Every glance at them carried love, loss, and responsibility. In this light, the confrontation was not simply about possessions. It was about memory, about inheritance, about the unbearable collision of trust and perception. Perhaps the most striking revelation is what this story says about human emotion under relentless pressure. Harry, carrying decades of grief and duty, filtered every action through the lens of loss and loyalty. Meghan, entering a legacy she understood differently, responded in ways that could be misinterpreted or weaponized by that very lens. The hidden cameras, the aides, the household staff, all bore witness to fragments of this tapestry. Yet, even their testimonies could not fully capture the depth of what transpired. And then came the twist that stunned even seasoned insiders. A witness insisted it was not a grand betrayal, but a seemingly minor gesture, small, almost trivial, that served as the spark. A hand reaching a look exchanged a pause too long. Something so ordinary, yet charged with context, that it tipped the balance from tension into confrontation. The mansion, the cameras, the heirlooms, they all became silent spectators to this transformative instant. And as the story is pieced together through fragments of film and whispered testimony, what emerges is not a scandal over jewels, but a human drama of fractured trust, distorted perception, and legacies too heavy to bear. Yet the ripples did not stop at Montecito's doors. They spread outward, shaping public perception, fueling media narratives, and becoming part of the ongoing global discourse surrounding Harry, Meghan, and the ever-lingering shadow of Diana's legacy. And just when it seemed the narrative had solidified, another revelation broke through, more shocking still. It tied together hidden observations with old Hollywood ties, past decisions, and secrets long thought buried. Because what is it about a piece of jewellery that makes it more than ornament? When it comes to Diana's collection, each item was imbued with weight far beyond its sparkle. They were not mere adornments. They were repositories of memory, fragments of a woman who had touched millions, and touchstones for children still carrying the scar of loss. And in Montecito, those jewels became flashpoints for suspicion and heartbreak, transforming into symbols around which love, grief, and accusation revolved. Take Diana's sapphire engagement ring, the most iconic of all. It was never just a jewel. It was meant as a promise, a continuity of love, a link between past and present. It had travelled decades of history, from Diana's hand to Meghan's carrying with it Harry's hope for both devotion and remembrance. Every time he looked at it, Harry saw his mother. Every touch was a silent dialogue with her memory. And that is why even the smallest perceived misstep with such an object could ignite a storm. Suspicion, anger, heartbreak, all were wrapped within the blue fire of that sapphire. The same was true of her other treasures, the delicate bracelets, the diamond earrings, the necklaces, passed quietly through generations. Each was more than heirloom. They were living vessels of trust, responsibility, and emotional inheritance. For Harry, the Montecito morning was never about monetary value. It was not about wealth, nor even inheritance. It was about what these jewels meant. To him, they embodied his mother, her love, and her lessons. The very idea that Meghan could mishandle them, even symbolically, was not a trivial concern. It was an emotional violation, a fracture in the sacred bond he was sworn to protect. What complicates this story even further is Meghan's relationship with these heirlooms. Sources suggest she fully understood their immense value, emotional, historical, and symbolic. At the same time, she recognised the attention, the power, and the narrative influence they could project onto the world stage. To the public and the media, possession of such treasures could too easily be misinterpreted as arrogance, entitlement, or greed. Yet, in reality, Meghan's interactions with these jewels were part of a far more complex intersection of symbolism, identity, and legacy. Whether she was handling them, speaking of them, or simply standing near them, every gesture became magnified, scrutinised in ways no ordinary object nor ordinary person would ever be. Inside Montecito, every step, every glance toward a display case, every brush of a hand near a necklace became charged with meaning. Witnesses recalled an atmosphere of almost cinematic intensity, where the jewels themselves seemed to radiate tension, transforming what began as a private disagreement into a confrontation with historical resonance. Harry's scream, "You thief, get out right now," was not provoked by a single motion alone. It was the culmination of perceived threats, the emotional weight of history, and the deep fear of symbolic trespass. The psychology of possession only heightened this drama. Humans naturally infuse objects tied to memory with emotional significance. For Harry, his mother's jewels were not material decorations. They were her presence, her voice, her trust made tangible. To lose them, or even to imagine their misuse was in his mind, to lose another piece of her, something irreplaceable. For Meghan, whose life had long been shaped by visibility, ambition, and calculated strategy, the jewels represented influence, responsibility, and a place within a narrative larger than herself. This clash of perceptions created fertile ground for misunderstanding and escalation. Insiders highlighted how even the most trivial details carried disproportionate weight. A casual comment about placement, a request regarding access, a movement near a case, all became lightning rods. Harry's eyes, witnesses noted, kept darting toward the collection, each glance sharpening his rising emotion. Meghan's gestures, measured and deliberate, were open to interpretation, defensive to some, conciliatory to others. But in such a charged environment, perception carried more force than truth. Adding to the intrigue, many witnesses described the jewels themselves as if they were characters in the unfolding drama. The sapphire's cold fire, the glitter of diamonds, the weight of gold, they seemed to exert their own gravity, a silent pull that intensified every human reaction in the room. When Harry's voice cracked with rage, when Meghan's composure trembled at the edges, the jewels were there, mute, unyielding, yet central. And then comes the speculation around access, a factor that layered even more tension onto the scene. Meghan's proximity to Diana's collection, though completely legal and often supervised, was perceived by Harry through a lens clouded by grief, memory, and unshakable protectiveness. To an outsider, Meghan might have been simply reaching for an object of beauty. To Harry, the act symbolised potential violation, possible disrespect, the unbearable fear that his mother's story was being distorted or forgotten. The lingering question of intent only deepened the divide. Did Meghan deliberately provoke Harry's fears? Was her behaviour meant to challenge, to reassure, or was it simply misunderstood within the weight of grief and legacy? Witnesses could not agree. Some saw calm, even protectiveness in her demeanour. Others perceived subtle manoeuvres, gestures that could be read as manipulative or defensive. The truth may never be fully known, but the perception alone was enough to ignite one of the most explosive confrontations in modern royal memory. Adding another dimension, those close to the household noted that Harry's thoughts were not confined to that morning. Every movement, every word was measured against the stories tied to each piece of jewellery. The sapphire ring chosen by Diana, the diamond-studded earrings she had worn on the world stage, the delicate bracelets passed down through in generations. Each item carried a chapter of history, a piece of grief, a fragment of memory. And in Harry's mind, to mishandle any of them, however innocently, was to mishandle Diana herself. Montecito, in that sense, was not merely a domestic scene. It became almost ceremonial, a testing ground of loyalty, trust, and reverence. In this crucible of emotion, the line between fact and perception blurred until they were indistinguishable. The atmosphere pulsed with forces that words could not capture. And just as it seemed the jewels themselves had defined the confrontation, another revelation surfaced, this one reaching beyond the mansion's walls. Whispers tied the morning's drama to old Hollywood connections, to royal expectations, and to private secrets Harry and Meghan thought were long buried. The confrontation was no longer just about heirlooms. It was about trust, fractured legacies threatened, and the collision of two lives whose histories had become combustible in the same room. Have you ever reached a moment when every memory, every fear, and every expectation converged into one unbearable instant? That is what happened to Prince Harry in Montecito. Weeks, months, even years of unspoken grief and quiet tension had built up beneath the surface. And now, with the Pacific stretching peacefully beyond the windows, all of it erupted in a torrent of emotion too powerful to contain. Witnesses described Harry pacing like a storm caged in human form, his fist tight, his jaw set, his movements restless, his voice swinging between sharp anger and raw vulnerability. "You thief! Get out, right now!" Those words, echoing off marble and glass, would later reverberate far beyond the mansion, fueling speculation and testimony alike. And yet, to Harry, they were not mere words. They were decades of grief, fear, and duty made flesh. For him, the outburst was not about Jules alone. It was about his mother, his family, and the unbearable moral weight of protecting a legacy that had been scrutinised, mythologized, and dissected ever since his childhood. The breaking point was not born of a single act, but from the relentless accumulation of perceived betrayals and symbolic provocations. Meghan's gestures that might have seemed insignificant to an outside observer, were magnified through the prism of Harry's emotional history. A lingering glance at a jewellery case, a pause before answering a carefully measured tone in conversation, each carried layers of meaning for him. In the pressurised environment of Montecito, those layers merged, transformed, and eventually ignited into something volatile and uncontainable. Consider the psychology of grief entwined with protective instinct. For decades, Harry had lived with the absence of his mother, struggling under relentless public scrutiny while trying to preserve his personal integrity. Every heirloom of Diana's was more than a possession. Each was a fragment of her, a relic of a life cut too short a bond to the woman he still mourned. The possibility that anyone might mishandle or diminish these objects was not merely upsetting. It felt like a violation, a rupture of the sacred emotional chain that bound past to present, mother to son, legacy to duty. Witnesses recalled that Harry's voice rose not only in anger, but in desperation. His pacing intensified, his gestures became broad and forceful, his urgency unmistakable, as if each second, without clarity, threatened something irreparable. Meghan, by contrast, maintained an outward composure, yet close observers noticed the subtleties. Trembling hands, tension etched around her eyes, a defensive shift of her shoulders. The contrast between Harry's storm of motion and Meghan's restrained calm created an atmosphere charged so heavily that one aide later described it as cinematic. It wasn't just an argument, it was a storm. Every glance, every word, every movement carried unbearable weight. The room itself seemed alive with tension. I've never seen anything like it. The mansion's architecture only intensified the moment. The high ceilings magnified sound. Light bounced across polished floors and cast elongated shadows on the walls. The openness of the space made Harry's fury seem larger, echoing inescapable, turning his words into thunder within his own home. But Harry's breaking point was not purely anger. It was frustration, fear, and helplessness made manifest. He had tried both publicly and privately to navigate his life with Meghan, balancing love with loyalty, his devotion to Diana with his duty as a husband. Yet in that moment, all strategies, all compromises dissolved. What erupted was raw, unfiltered emotion, stripped of pretense of diplomacy, of restraint. What makes this breaking point so compelling is its emotional duality. Harry's fury was inseparable from his vulnerability. Even in his loudest accusations, his voice carried undertones of grief, doubt, and longing. Observers noted brief moments when his intensity faltered, when anger softened into hesitation, as though the confrontation itself was almost too much to endure. Meghan, facing the storm, was forced to navigate more than words. She was grappling with the full force of Harry's history, his pain, and his desperate need for preservation. Every gesture, every phrase was weighted with consequence. One misstep, one wrong tone, could fan the flames into something greater still. This is where perception eclipsed intent. Some insiders argued that Meghan's measured responses appeared manipulative. Her calmness, a tactic that only deepened Harry's suspicions. Others insisted she was simply trying to steady herself, to keep order in a setting where even a blink might be misread. The truth underscores a universal reality: in emotionally charged moments, perception almost always overrides intention. What is meant as reassurance can be received as provocation. What is meant as patience can be seen as calculation. And then there was the timing. Insiders emphasised that the confrontation did not exist in isolation. Earlier that very morning, smaller disagreements had already sown tension. Add to that months, if not years, of unspoken grievances and anxieties simmering beneath the surface, and Harry's outburst was inevitable. By the time he reached his breaking point, every memory of past struggles, every fragment of grief for Diana, every fear about trust and legacy had coalesced into one unstoppable moment. In that crucible, even ordinary objects became symbols of immense consequence. The jewels, once passive heirlooms, seemed to take on agency, active participants in the storm. Each bracelet, each ring, each necklace was a story, and a fragment of Diana herself, a reminder of a love and a loss that shaped Harry's existence. Their presence alone heightened sensitivity, turning small gestures into perceived acts of trespass. A glance toward a display case, a hand lingering near a necklace, a question about placement, all became accelerants in an already volatile space. The breaking point was also amplified by isolation. Removed from the gaze of the world, Montecito offered no buffers, no courtiers, no protocols to temper emotion. In that privacy, there was nothing to filter or restrain Harry's eruption. What emerged was unmediated, unshielded, leaving both Harry and Meghan exposed to the full magnitude of their histories and their differences. Witnesses later described the climax of the confrontation as almost surreal. Harry's words, his gestures, his pacing filled the mansion with energy so palpable it seemed to warp perception. Meghan's responses, simultaneously calm, defensive, and deliberate, interacted with Harry's fury to create a dynamic that was unpredictable, volatile, unforgettable. This was not a domestic quarrel. It was an emotional collision shaped by grief, legacy, perception, and human frailty. And even in that climax, Another spark flared, small in action, monumental in meaning. Some accounts say it was Meghan's movement toward the jewels. Others suggest it was a comment subtle but sharp that Harry read as confirmation of his darkest fears. Whatever it was, that single moment pushed Harry past the point of control, cementing the confrontation as one of the most explosive and emotionally charged private incidents in recent royal memory. But just as it seemed Harry had reached the very edge of his endurance, an unexpected element entered the room, something neither he nor Meghan had foreseen. It was subtle, almost invisible at first, yet its presence altered the emotional landscape with seismic effect. That shift, small in appearance but monumental in consequence, would shape not only the outcome of that morning in Montecito, but also the narrative that spiralled outward in the days and weeks that followed. The moment was no longer confined to a private quarrel. It became the catalyst for a chain reaction nobody, not even those within the mansion, could have anticipated. Have you ever noticed how quickly a deeply private incident can explode into a global spectacle in our digital age? For Harry and Meghan, what transpired behind closed doors in Montecito did not remain private. Its reverberations spread outward, like waves amplified by whispers, then leaks, then the unstoppable engines of social media. What began as an argument within four walls became a frenzy that ricocheted across continents. Within mere hours, the quiet hum of speculation had erupted into a storm. Cryptic posts appeared online, vague hints about tension in Montecito, oblique comments about Harry's sudden mood, murmurs about Diana's jewels. At first, these breadcrumbs seemed minor, passed between curious followers, dismissed by skeptics. But in the digital ecosystem, where engagement drives visibility, even whispers can become thunder. Algorithms thrive on conflict and controversy. They detect spikes in attention, amplify emotional narratives, and feed audiences the most sensational fragments. Soon, what had been a handful of insider remarks metastasized into global chatter. The drama spread like wildfire. Memes appeared, tweets multiplied, Instagram stories speculated, TikTok videos dissected every possible scenario. Did Harry truly scream those words? What did he mean by "you thief"? Was Meghan careless with Diana's heirlooms, or was she misunderstood? Theories multiplied, each one more detailed, more speculative than the last. Thousands of voices turned into millions, each offering their own interpretation, each shaping the story in real time. What makes social media uniquely powerful and uniquely perilous is its ability to collapse fact and perception into a single narrative. Screenshots, out of context clips, and second-hand rumours are elevated to the status of evidence. Subtleties are lost, contradictions erased. Every gesture, every glance, every silence becomes fodder for commentary. In Montecito's case, online observers constructed entire narratives out of fragments. A single phrase became a headline. A witness account, distorted by retelling, became a viral theory. And so what was once a raw, intimate, and deeply human confrontation began to live a second life online. It was dissected, exaggerated, mocked, defended. For Harry and Meghan, the ordeal was no longer only about the emotions in that room. It was about how the world consumed, judged, and reinterpreted those emotions in a digital theatre where perception mattered more than truth.